Do you feel like making small games is a waste of time? I get no joy in making smaller games. Thank you, past me, but that's not very helpful, and while it did come from a good place, the major problem isn't the bad advice, but it's the real reason we don't want to work on small indie games. You see, for me personally, every time I sit down and think about a game idea, things like Elden Ring or Skyrim come to mind. A nice open-world RPG where players could get lost for hours upon hours exploring a brand new world. In fact, my current project, The Steps of Divynia, was heavily inspired and would not even be around if it wasn't for Hollow Knight. Yet, when Rocky Mullet Game Dev made this comment on my past video, I had to ask myself, is there something that I'm missing? That something turned out to be that I was making small games the wrong way. And so no wonder I didn't feel motivated to make them. I kept thinking, this small game has to wow people. It has to explore new mechanics or reinvent the wheel in some fresh and interesting way. Not to mention, I had to make everything for it. And so, there's no wonder that I would get frustrated, because it was like I was trying to grab a wrench to drive in the nail into my wall. Then, when the nail would bend, I'd yell at the wrench for not doing its job correctly. Sure, maybe eventually that wrench will get that nail into the wall, but by the time it does, I'm going to be exhausted, or the nail just might break. So, in this video, I want to talk about the right way to make small indie games. So that way, we all can use a hammer, not a wrench, when making our games. Now, in order to do that, the very first thing you're going to have to do is think about your dream game. Now, I know what I just said. Hear me out. We want to think about the mechanics from this game that excites you. What I ultimately want to make is an open world RPG, like The Witcher 3 or Skyrim. So, if I were to break down those mechanics into their smaller parts, the things that I actually enjoy from these types of games include a deep branching story, different skills based on levels or maybe weapons, Souls-like combat, party NPCs that can follow you around and help you, and of course, the open world mechanic. Now immediately, I can cross a few of those off my list as I decide to pick a mechanic from my dream game to turn into a much smaller indie game. The reason is because, well, those things are way too big and I'm not smart enough to figure out how to break them down any further. Nor do I really want to. Instead, there are two here that I personally really want to focus on. A deep branching story and Souls-like combat. Thus, with a bit of Metroidvania inspiration, instead of making a huge open-world RPG, The Steps of Divynia was born. Yet, as I'm finding out these past few months, and over the course of the past year, even this is still too much for me. Thus, when I think about breaking it down even further, and what I can do to keep myself excited and motivated for this much smaller indie project, I can select a problem from The Steps of Divynia, aka my current project, and build that into an even smaller game. So when I stop and think about what exactly has me stuck, I think about gamepad controls when trying to navigate through UI. You see, Unreal doesn't have super intuitive UI functions when it comes to controller input, at least not as intuitive as Unity. Furthermore, one of the things in The Steps of Divynia that I really want to get right is pogo combat. So when the mini game jam started here just this past Friday, I thought, what about combining those two ideas? It would just simply be a game where you can use the gamepad to control all aspects of the game, and the only mechanic that the game would include would be a pogo mechanic. Thus, the idea for my little small indie game is just to have a knight, and his goal is to just never touch the ground. So he has to pogo across the level until he reaches the end. Furthermore, another problem that I'm running into, to just drive the example even further, is that I'm having enemy AI problems. Someone mentioned in my last video that the game seemed really easy and the enemies weren't that rough. I know that. And unfortunately, when it comes to programming AI, I'm a little stuck. Therefore, one of my future ideas for a smaller project is a game centered just around enemy AI. Don't quite have the details for that made out yet, but the idea is that it would relate back to the Steps of Divynia in some way. As game developers, we know that once we have completed something for the first time, each time we do it afterward, it becomes a lot easier, does not take as long to implement, and we get slightly better at it. Therefore, the hope is by taking current problems that I'm running into in my current project, I can not only overcome those issues, but I won't have the feeling that I'm wasting time, which used to be a big hurdle that I needed to get over. At the end of the day, game dev is all about being curious. We try new things, and if they don't work out, we sometimes get too frustrated, or we think very linearly about how this equates to a failure, or this was a waste of time, and why should I even have bothered to begin with? Yet that curiosity is super important to nourish and to uplift us as game developers. It's what lets us try these new things to begin with. It's just the expectation of being good or perfect at it is what holds us back. You're going to be bad at something when it's the first time you've tried to do it. Furthermore, the only way to get better and the only way to truly understand what you like both as a game dev and as just a person in general is to try these new things. A good example of all of this is I've been getting back into art the past month. Before that, I would consider myself a terrible artist who was ashamed of everything that I would create. But now, after putting enough time, effort, and energy, I feel like it's starting to finally click. And when something finally starts to click, we start to see it in a new light. You see, I don't like 2D games very much, but there's something about creating something yourself, even if it's not a game that you may particularly play yourself, that makes it special. And I remember feeling a glint of joy when things started to look and come out the way that I had wanted them to. And that wasn't because it was the first time I had created something. In fact, my first attempt at making a knight turned out rather poor, if I'm being honest. Yet, instead of being discouraged and deciding to give up or quit, I decided to wonder what would happen if I simplified it even more. Thus, that curious thought of simplification allowed me to try to make a much smaller version. That smaller version being something I'm proud of that I can continue to make this small little project on. Furthermore, it's also super important to realize that when you make these small indie games, they are and should be focused around problems or skills that you wish to grow as an individual. Thus, for me as someone who wants to get better at programming, art, and animation, those are the three things that I should really focus on when making this smaller project. Therefore, things like music, level design, game design, it's not something I'm going to put a whole lot of effort into or time. And finally, the final step is to remember why you decided to get into game development to begin with. Now, I've talked about ironing out your why in a previous video, so if that's something you're really struggling with, then I suggest to watch that video linked in the time card up above. But real quick, just for the purposes of this video, ironing out your why just means simply, why did you get into game development to begin with? What do you hope the people who play your game take from the game? And I don't necessarily mean the genre or the story, but how do you want them to feel? How do you, as the individual game developer, want their lives to be better? And so with all that being said, you're probably going to see a lot less on the Steps of Divynia. Instead, I want to focus a lot more on the individual problems that I'm currently facing and the game projects that I decide to come up with in order to overcome them. Of course, that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop working on the Steps of Divynia. I'm just going to slow down and allow myself to build the skills necessary in order to achieve my own personal goals. Speaking of goals and problems, I mentioned that one of the things that I'm trying to work on is my art and animation skills. Therefore, every day for the past few weeks, I've been posting these animations on my personal website. You can check them out if you're interested in following that journey by clicking in the description below. And so now we've come around full circle. I hope this video was helpful in at least some small way, and hopefully you now have a new opinion on small indie projects, especially if you're like me and you struggled with them in the past. But anyway, that's going to be it for me in this video, and until next time, stay awesome, keep creating, and remember to spark the imagination. Goodbye!